Hi there, and welcome to this awareness-raising presentation on the policy aimed at combating mistreatment of elders and any adult in a vulnerable situation. My name is Bonnie Helwer, and I'm the person responsible for implementing the policy. I'm part of the Quality Evaluation, Performance, and Ethics team at the Health Board. I also work closely with José Duplanty, Planning and Programming Agent for the Wellness of Elders and Regional Coordinator specialized in the fight against mistreatment on the Planning and Programming team at the Health Board as well. For your information, you can click on the hyperlink in the title of this presentation, which will take you to the Health Board website, where you can find the policy. In this presentation, we will discuss the main points of the policy, including the law, which is the act to strengthen the fight against maltreatment of seniors and other persons of full age in vulnerable situations, people concerned by the policy and the clientele targeted, definitions, objectives, values, and principles, promotion, diffusion, and training, identification and management of situations of mistreatment, mandatory reporting, the trajectory for reporting mistreatment, support measures, disciplinary, administrative, or criminal sanctions, where to find the policy, and we will end with a recap. The policy stems from the law, which imposes on every establishment the obligation to adopt and implement a policy to combat mistreatment of the elderly and any adult in a vulnerable situation. More specifically, the policy must outline obligations for stakeholders, the mandatory reporting criteria, and specific protective measures. I hope that the policy and the associated documentation will support you in any situation of mistreatment you may encounter. You can click on the hyperlink to directly access a copy of the law. The question you might ask is, who does the policy apply to? The policy applies to everyone who works for the health centers and the health board, as well as all health and social service providers. These providers include, among others, people working for organizations used by the health centers or the health board to provide services. It should be noted that, even though the policy is specifically aimed at the stakeholders mentioned, addressing mistreatment remains everyone's responsibility. It is important to understand the clientele that is targeted by the policy. It applies to elders as well as any adult in a vulnerable situation. A person in a vulnerable situation means anyone whose ability to ask for or obtain assistance is temporarily or permanently limited, due in particular to a constraint, an illness, an injury, or a disability, which may be physical, cognitive, or psychological, such as physical or intellectual disabilities or an autism spectrum disorder. Excluded from the policy are those under 18 years of age, as this clientele falls under the jurisdiction of youth protection. The policy details several definitions: well treatment, mistreatment, people in vulnerable situations, the definition of which I just presented on the previous slide, and health and social service providers. This section provides a common understanding of the main elements of the vocabulary used throughout the document. For further information, the types of mistreatment are also defined in the Appendix 1 of the policy. Since this is the main purpose of the policy, let me bring to your attention the definition of mistreatment or maltreatment as defined by the law. This is a single or repeated act or a lack of appropriate action that occurs in a relationship where there's an expectation of trust and that intentionally or unintentionally causes harm or distress to a person. The main objectives of the policy are to ensure a common understanding of mistreatment and to establish best practices for prevention and intervention through implementation of guidelines, strategies, and measures to combat mistreatment. Organizational values are recognized in the policy, such as kindness, respect, cooperation, and accountability. In a context of cultural safety, that means taking into consideration the person's different life experiences, listening, treating them with respect and consideration, and recognizing their uniqueness. The policy includes information on promoting well treatment, prevention, awareness raising, and training for staff and partners. There is specific training recommended for external partners, such as community organizations, private service providers, and service agencies. You can use the link to access these training courses. Any partner has access simply with an email and by following the link. The policy states that it is everyone's responsibility to combat mistreatment and support a culture of caring. Appendix 1 of the policy explains the different types of mistreatment in more detail, such as psychological, physical, sexual, material or financial, institutional, ageism, and the violation of rights. The consent of the victim or their legal representative must always be sought. However, there are two exceptions where consent is not required in order to share information about a situation of mistreatment. That is, when a case meets criteria for mandatory reporting. I will explain what mandatory reporting is on the next slide. And when there's a risk of death or serious injury. In these cases, it is necessary and appropriate to share information to prevent harm. What is mandatory reporting? Both the law and the policy state that in certain cases, service providers or members of a professional order are required to report situations of mistreatment to the Service Quality and Complaints Commissioner. This is the case for the types of clients we see here: an adult living in a long-term care center, an intermediate resource, or a family-type home; an adult in a vulnerable situation who resides in a private elder's residence; an inapt adult under guardianship or with a probated protection mandate; any other adult whose incapacity has been established through a medical assessment. In Nunavik, resources are not formally categorized in the same way as they are in the rest of the province. This can make the application of mandatory reporting more complex for staff. However, it is important to remember that outside the scope of mandatory reporting, anyone, whether a professional or not, may report a situation of suspected mistreatment to the Service Quality and Complaints Commissioner based on their personal, professional, or ethical convictions. With this tool, you will find in the left column the resources the staff can call upon when they report mistreatment or need support. You will also find in the column on the right resources for anyone to get help or support in order to address and follow up any situation of mistreatment. Please be aware that support and guidance is available at every stage of the process and for everyone involved in a situation of mistreatment. Please don't hesitate to use these services. Without wanting to foster a culture of blame, but rather to cultivate individual accountability, the policy informs us of the measures applicable in the event of non-compliance. You can learn more by consulting the policy in greater detail. However, sanctions are possible against anyone who fails to comply with their obligation to report mistreatment or anyone who perpetrates an act of mistreatment. Finally, in accordance with the terms and application of the policy, it must be exposed in public view. It is published on the website and should be displayed in long-term care homes. In conclusion, let's suppose I'm facing a situation of mistreatment. Who can I contact for support? You can call your CLSC or you can contact the appropriate Service Quality and Complaints Commissioner. For listening and support, you can reach out to the Mistreatment Helpline, Inuit Values and Practices, the Kamatsiatuk Helpline, or the Hope for Wellness Helpline for First Nations and Inuit. Thank you for your participation. I would like to thank the regional coordinator specialized in the fight against mistreatment at the CIUS des Laurentides for inspiring this presentation. I hope I've managed to demystify the policy for you. Please feel free to read it in more detail to improve your knowledge. Together, we can address mistreatment and improve the quality of life of elders and adults in vulnerable situations across Nunavik. Nakwamik